In the winter register of 1842, amid the pale ink of food rations and coal allowances, there was a single unnamed entry. A single line, nestled in the edge of the admission column, read Uncle's fever quarantine. Requested cell 17. There was no discharge date, no attending physician. The ink was darker than the rest, sharp, undimmed by the years. And strangely enough, the handwriting never appeared again in the register. Nearly a century later, when archivists examined the hospital's incarceration records, they found that every room was clearly numbered except one. Cell 17 was not on the blueprints, but it was still present in the actual structure. Brick-walled, reinforced with 4 iron locks intact until the building was declared unsafe. The corridors around it had been repaved at least twice, but the threshold of cell 17 had never been altered. Meals were recorded regularly until 1879. Not a single meal was refused. No one ever mentioned a food delivery, no pictures of the door. No one remembers who first locked it, and the only note that survived other than the first entry was found on a ration card, folded flat, odorless, tucked into a wall slot. He hasn't coughed in years. If you're listening, leave your country and your current time. There's something comforting in knowing that we, though separated in time and space, have stopped together at that sealed door. This is a story that's been kept silent, locked in iron, and told only through unquestioned meals. This is the story of the sick man who was quarantined alone for 37 years. The winter of 1842 settled over the Ohio River like a heavy, damp wool blanket. The riverbank was frozen-lined with simple brick buildings, institutions not for the mind, but for the body. Among them was the Ohio River Psychiatric Institute, a building neither ornate nor bleak, simply an administrative institution. The windows were symmetrical, the roof was speckled with snow, the chimneys exhaled a silence like cold coal. Inside the reception room, records were written in standard ink, name date, condition, origin, from the Valley Farm or factory. The diagnosis was clear melancholy, hysteria, epilepsy. But on the morning of January 12th, an admission slip broke the mold. It was simple and dry male, about 34 years old. Diagnosis: unstable fever. Quarantine recommended. No name, no next of kin, no place of origin, no attending physician, just a dash in place of a signature. By the following Thursday, the patient was in cell 17. There had been no breach of procedure, at least. No one talked about it. The hospital had long had a separate isolation corridor, mostly for transients, sometimes for the dead. Cell 17 had not been used for more than a year. It was at the end of the south wing, past the laundry room and the old kitchen well. The last occupant had been released the previous spring. But now, without a request, without a note, it was being prepared. A nurse, her name barely legible in the surviving personnel records, had written a brief note that weekend. No rash, no sweats, unexplained fever, cooperative but unresponsive. 2 days later, a carpenter was summoned. Cell 17 had a fourth lock added on the outside, directly on the stone wall next to the door, not in the door frame. The lock was hand-forged, accessible only to senior staff, and there was no key in the master lock. No repair orders were filed. The carpenter's name, though listed in that week's maintenance log with minor entries like the heater lever or the window frame, was completely absent from the entry relating to the fourth lock. There was only a blank line and a symbol never to be seen again in the records. When questioned years later by the Internal Affairs Committee, former employees had little recollection of the man. A nurse said he never spoke. A cleaning staff member thought he coughed, but no one had ever heard him. A manager described him as neutral, then explained not disruptive, but not really present, and yet the door was locked. Within a month, a feeding routine was established. Trays placed on the floor outside the door retrieved after an hour. No contact, no communication. Strange patient records, no refusals, no further requests. No name on that year's census. Room marked with faint pencil strokes disappears after copying. Does not appear in the main register submitted to the county auditor. Room 17 simply does not exist. The panel, the one that contained the fourth lock, was also odd. It was made of oak, smooth and freshly varnished, but the grain was uneven, as if it had been salvaged from old material. The fixing screws were mismatched, 2 brass, 1 bronze, and the pin was hand-filed slightly off-center. When closed, the panel lay flush with the wall, almost invisible, unless you knew exactly where to press it, and someone apparently knew. Since the panel had been installed, the procedure for cell 17 had changed. The morning shift required a senior officer to open the fourth lock at dawn and close it at dusk. These duties were not recorded in the official schedule, but were handwritten on folded pieces of paper and passed around in silence. There were no instructions on how to handle the fourth lock in case of an emergency. No employee had ever admitted to opening the door in an emergency. Room 17 had no internal call bell, no eye-level windows. The overhead air vent had been blocked from the outside with a hinged cover, a measure usually reserved for extremely dangerous patients. But no incident, no report had ever been recorded to justify that level of precaution. Even the structure of the corridor began to be puzzling. In 1844, while whitewashing the South Corridor as usual, 2 maintenance workers, Mr. Corwin and Mr. Leeds, asked for clarification about the plaque and locking mechanism. They could not find it on the ward's engineering drawings, which had been updated only 3 years earlier after a fire drill. According to the drawings, each room had only 3 locks. No wall compartments were marked. Their request was passed on to the ward manager, who replied simply, "It works fine. There is no need to investigate its origin." 3 months later, Corwin resigned. Leeds stayed on, but refused any duties related to the South Corridor. In a personal notebook found decades later in a pile of abandoned furniture, Leeds had sketched a rough diagram of the locking system under which was written in small letters, "The fourth makes no sound when opened." Visitors to the institute, already rare, almost never walked down that corridor. But when they did, they often noted something strange, the absence of sound. A stone corridor that should have echoed here. Even the sound of footsteps seemed to be muffled. A state inspector in 1846 noted, "South Corridor, strange sound, drier, doors thicker than measured." Only one photograph survives of that corridor, taken in 1892, just before the building was demolished. It shows 5 doors. Room 17 is the last on the left. The door looked identical to the others, except for one detail, a rectangular shadow, just to the right of the frame. The discoloration was very faint, about the size of a notebook. The wooden board had been removed by then, the space filled and whitewashed. But if you adjusted the contrast of the image, you could see something else, a faint black line extending below. the shadow vertical and low like a handprint pressed into the wall long after the fourth lock had been forgotten. By the spring of 1843, the men's wing of the Ohio River Asylum had acquired a peculiar reputation, not in the administrative reports, not in the visitor logs, but in the averted glances and brief nods among the staff. It was not called haunted, not cursed, but simply referred to as that row, with enough hesitation to make it clear that no further explanation was necessary. It was just a straight corridor 32 paces long, with 5 sick rooms on one side and smooth stone walls on the other, cold even in summer. Oil lamps were installed at regular intervals. The ceiling was featureless. Windows were rare and narrow. On paper, the corridor was no different from the rest of the institution. But footsteps here sounded different. A staff member scribbled in the corner of his March duty diary. I walked twice, heard only once. Another more pragmatic person crossed his name off the list and wrote, prefer the west side. The sound here is wrong. That same month, a quiet change was made. The March 11, 1843 book, written in smudged ink on thin onion paper, recorded a small change in procedure. All meals for room 17 prepared on time. Leave trays on benches in the men's corridor. Delivery handled by yourself. No need for lower-ranking staff to go beyond the archway. A smaller note, possibly from the manager, read, the sound here is strange, distorts distances. No signature, no date. But from that point on, no one admitted to ever going down that corridor after dusk. The kitchen staff began calling the end of the corridor the blind bend, even though it was perfectly straight. One claimed his trolley slowed down there, even though the floor was perfectly flat. Others said the air seemed compressed thick and refused to push the food cart any further. Instead, the tray was left on the chair, and each time, the tray disappeared. Returned empty. No one called, no one asked. But the process repeated itself for 36 years. In June 1843, a new sweeper named Elias Wren was assigned to clean the south corridor. He had been on the job for only 2 weeks. When he returned, he was pale silent, and the mop completely dry. The panel was strange. It was polished oak, freshly painted, but the grain was uneven, as if it had been recut from old stock. The screws were mismatched, 2 brass, 1 copper, and the latch was crooked, as if hand-filed, leaning slightly to one side. When closed, the panel fit flush against the wall, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to press it, and someone did. Since its installation, the routine for maintaining room 17 had changed. The morning shift had been mandatory for senior staff, never new staff. The 4th lock had to be released at dawn, then locked again at sunset. These duties were not recorded in the work schedule. They appeared only as hand-folded notes passed among staff. There was no record of how the lock was to be used in an emergency. No staff member had ever admitted to opening the door during duty hours. There were no bell cords, no windows at eye level. The upper bars were also sealed with wooden panels hinged from the outside, a measure reserved for dangerous patients. But there were no reports of incidents, no justification for the precaution. The architecture of the South Corridor also raised some suspicions. During a whitewash in 1844, 2 new maintenance men, Mr. Corwin and Mr. Leeds, asked about the mechanism of the wall panel when they could not find it in the plans, which had been updated 3 years earlier after a fire drill. According to the plans, each room had only 3 locks. No wall compartments were noted. When the question reached the superintendent, he simply said, "It works." You don't care who made it. Coven quit 3 months later. Leeds stayed on but refused any duties on the South Corridor. In a personal notebook discovered decades later among the old relics, Leeds made only a brief entry below a sketch of the locking system. The fourth lock makes no sound when turned. Visitors to the camp, already rare, almost never entered this corridor. But those who did pass through it noticed something strange. The corridor did not resonate. The paving stones should have echoed the sound of footsteps, but here every movement seemed to be swallowed up. A state inspector in 1846 noted in his notebook, "South corridor strangely resonant, air dry, doors thicker than measured." Only one surviving photograph of the corridor was taken in 1892, just before demolition. It shows 5 doors. Room 17 was the last on the left. The door was identical to the others except for one detail, a rectangular shadow just to the right of the door frame. A faint discoloration about the size of a notebook. The panel had been removed, the hole filled and painted white. But if one adjusted the contrast of the image, one could see a black streak running vertically just below the shadow, like a handprint imprinted in the mortar left after the fourth lock had been forgotten. In the spring of 1843, the South Corridor began to acquire an unusual reputation, not recorded in reports or diaries, but lingering in the averted eyes and hesitant words of the staff. It was not called haunted, it was not called cursed. It was simply that corridor. A name that stood alone with a pause after it. The corridor was straight, 32 paces long. 5 patient doors on one side, cold stone walls on the other, always cold, even in summer. The ceiling was plain, the lights were even, there were no architectural irregularities. And yet, the sound of footsteps there was unlike any other. One nurse wrote in the margin of her schedule, "I walked twice, heard only one." Another crossed out her name from her shift and wrote in her place, "Transferred to the West Ward." Sounds strange. That same month, a small change was quietly implemented. In the kitchen diary of March 11th, 1843, printed in crisp ink on onion paper, there was a correction. All meals for room 17 prepared punctually. Placed on bench in front of South Corridor. No need for lower staff to enter. A side note in smaller type, possibly from the manager, added, "The noise here makes the distance wrong." No signature, no date. But from then on, no staff admitted to ever having passed through the corridor after dusk. The kitchen staff began calling the end of the corridor the blind bend, though there was no bend at all. One said her trolley always slowed down there even though the floor was flat. Another refused to push trays through it, saying the air was as thick as wool, so the trays were left on the bench. Always gone by the next collection. No one called, no one asked, and so it went on for 36 years. In June 1843, a janitor named Elias Wren was assigned to mop the corridor. He had been on the job for only 2 weeks. When he returned, his face was pale and he did not say a word. The mop was still dry. The water bucket had not been touched. When asked, he said only, "I heard someone was with me. Not behind, not in front, but next to me." He quit that same afternoon. His name was struck from the personnel book and no one replaced him. The state inspection report of 1844 did not mention the corridor. It only talked about the overcrowded West Ward leaking boiler valves, and a few disruptive patients. There was only a vague note in the margin of page 9. South, no sense of companionship. In late autumn of the same year, a carpenter was assigned to reinforce the corridor door frame. When he removed the baseboard near room 17, he found that the wood inside was not damp, not worm-eaten, not cracked, but retracted. The wood had separated from the nails as if it had been pulled in from the inside. He did not finish the job. The ledge was hastily nailed down. When asked, he shrugged and pointed to the floor. That place is strangely quiet. Not like wood. An 1845 letter from the housekeeper to her sister in Steubenville reads, "I avoid that place after prayer. The hall is as quiet as an empty stomach, entering without an echo, as if someone had already passed through." In 1846, a proposal to build a storage closet just off the hall was submitted, citing reduced efficiency. It was not approved. No reason. But the door to the hall was bolted. It was the only hall with a door. On that door, painted in pale grey stone ink, were 2 words printed in hard strokes by an unidentified hand. 2 years later, erased without a record, services ended. The phrase "unstable fever" disappeared from the records. In its place, a new term appeared, a persistent nervous condition capable of being transmitted by close contact. The quarantine was extended. Further testing was not recommended. The margins narrowed. The handwriting changed, still handwriting, but now the round formal strokes were replaced by a flat, quiet style, more like the writing of a clerk than a doctor. The ink became darker. And in 1861, a page appeared, signed by Dr. Isaac Turn, the chief physician of the quarantine. But Dr. Turn had been dead for 7 years. His death was clearly noted in the obituary, accompanied by a black ribbon in the chapel Bible. He had no surviving relatives. His handwriting, however, is preserved in at least 3 surviving documents, and the signature in the 1861 entry is a perfect match. The slant, the curve of the eye are identical. The note reads, "Patient completely compliant. Movements normal. No signs of conscious resistance. Permanent isolation recommended. Infection status inconclusive." Below the signature, the ink has not soaked into the paper. It lies on the surface as if the pen had been pressed lightly and indifferently. No emotion, no smudges, no signs of aging. The print beneath the date remains faint as if it had been pressed recently. No one on staff at the time objected, at least no records survive. Subsequent entries follow a similar trend. The language becomes passive. Observations are no longer labeled with witnesses. Dates become vague: early March, first week of fall. Diagnoses drifted away from medicine into the language of the bureaucracy. Condition unchanged. No external complications. Orders extended, not forwarded. By 1871, a particularly chilling entry appeared. Cell 17. Condition dormant. Signature NA. The physician's name was left blank. The diagnosis box was filled in with a faint, almost erased pencil. No threat, but no contact. When state medical historians reviewed the records decades later, the entry was flagged for inspection. The book had no archive number. The label on the spine had been overwritten with different writing. The pages were not stitched together with thread, but glued together with glue. An old-fashioned glue that had only begun to be used in hospital records in the 1880s. The final entry, however, was dated June 7th, 1875. An internal memo was found, folded into the back cover. It read, "To your successor, please leave the notes as they are. We have rewritten them too many times." There was no signature, but what sent the archivists shivering was not the incorrect dates, nor the inconsistent language, nor the improbable signature. It was a faint mark at the bottom of the last page, a single word slanted along the edge, half hidden by the binding. Not a seal, not a watermark. A single handwritten word copied. No one knew who had written it. No staff member could explain why the ink was still fresh after so many years. Inside the Volmer Leather Hospital Register Volume Turkey, the admission slip for cell 17 appears as it always has, complete, orderly and correct. Among the hundreds of patient names from January to March 1844, there is only one blank line, one field that has never been filled in. The patient's name field is blank, that much is confirmed. Estimated age unknown, condition unstable fever. But it is the last column that really catches one's eye. A box outlined in a uniform line titled "Expected Duration of Treatment." Below, no longer blank, is a section of paper that has been torn and disfigured. The original writer left the box blank. Someone later removed it, not by erasing it with ink, not by blacking it out, but by scratching it as if trying to peel away the paper's fibers. 3 parallel scratches crisscross the entire box, from corner to corner, tearing it without completely piercing it. Another person then tried to glue a piece of linen over the tear, but the glue didn't stick. The scratch extended to the cell above it. The patient on the top row, an epileptic from Dayton, was discharged after 2 months. His name is still visible. Length of stay, 10 weeks. As for cell 17, never recorded. Later, the asylum's administrators attempted to compile the records of the entire asylum. Most patients had admission and discharge dates. That had been mandatory since 1855. But cell 17 refused to be counted. Every form had a backup entry, a discharge date, or a note still under treatment. But for cell 17, there was no release, no decision to continue detention, no doctor's signature. There was only one phrase repeated in the margin: "No need for re-evaluation." That phrase appeared at least 11 times between 1845 and 1872. No one explained why there was no reassessment. Even the most hopeless cases, severe depression, moral insanity, terminal tuberculosis, were reassessed every quarter. Some were allowed to write to their families, others were considered for transfer to the workhouse or to the chapel. But not cell 17, it remained as it was. No words, no protests, no demands, and silence seemed to be answered with silence. An 1850 request from the ward's administrator, Selma Riggs, to reclassify the entire southern ward read, "Room 17 recommended for diagnostic evaluation. Patient seen to rise at the evening bell." The report was returned with a red pencil, a question mark next to the note, and another scrawled line: "Not under current treatment." Initials EH. There was no one named EH in the personnel records that year. By 1866, cell 17 was only mentioned in the administrative diagram. On the floor plan, a small box surrounded the room. The simple, unmistakable inscription retained: "Isolation ward. Do not enter." The steward was never found. When questioned staff could only recall his name, Thomas Lyle struck from the kitchen's attendance sheet a week prior, with no reason filed. The director claimed Lyle had resigned, yet no letter was submitted, no formal note recorded. and still the question lingered if cell 17 was truly unoccupied. Why did the meal logs continue without pause? Volume 6 of the meal rotation ledger confirmed uninterrupted deliveries. 3 meals daily, no refusals. Each tray logged as retrieved, each cup returned empty. A curious annotation from the autumn weeks of 1863 read, plainly, cup returned with folded napkin. No complaint. Cell 17. Simultaneously, the door rotation ledger, an official record of mechanical inspections, listed cell 17 as bolted X4 sound no damage. The initials verifying these entries were illegible. No staff matched them. What most unsettled Clark Moore, a newly arrived auditing clerk, was what he heard on his third evening at the asylum. At approximately 9:12 p.m., while crossing the southern hallway to deposit tally sheets into the director's Dropbox, he stopped just short of the corridor leading to cell 17. The rest of the building had hushed. Coal scuttles rattled faintly from the furnace, and mice stirred behind the walls. But beneath those mundane sounds was something else, a soft, deliberate scrape, not abrupt, not animal. A careful drag, like a tray pulled across floorboards. The silence that followed felt attentive, almost sentient, observed but not from any direction, more from behind the walls themselves. Moore noted the incident in his travel journal, heard something in the corridor. Long movement, no echo. Felt watched not from ahead, but within. The entry ended abruptly, not by error but by omission. That same week, among his personal items, a draft letter addressed to the State Oversight Board was discovered. Unsigned and unsent, it read, "Respectfully, I believe the submitted census is accurate only in ink. Cell 17 is not unoccupied. It is only unacknowledged." The letter was never mailed. The envelope remained unstamped, the page unfolded. Moore departed the asylum on February 3rd, citing illness. His final note, scribbled in the margin of a transfer ledger, read, "The door was never unbolted, but it still knew the census was coming. No corrections were ever filed. Federal records continued listing cell 17 as empty." And yet, the sound of the tray dragging inward returned the very next night. Same time, same hallway. The superintendent's office at the Ohio River Asylum was rarely occupied for long. The structure itself, tall stone wide corridors, weathered time better than those appointed to command it. 3 directors in particular, Dr. Elias Hollings, Joseph Verrill, and Augustus Matt, left behind evidence of their quiet complicity in what the staff only whispered about the room that outlasted them all. Dr. Elias Hollings assumed authority in 1845, shortly after the 4th bolt had been added to cell 17. His records were famously austere. Not a single direct mention of the patient within the cell exists. However, tucked into the South Wing archive, his initials EH appear beside a maintenance requisition form recommending continued restrictions for room 17. No interruption to meal delivery. No physician signed it. No diagnosis was listed. Just the initials. Hollings resigned in 1853, citing fatigue of the lungs. He died 2 months later at a coastal convalescent home. Among his personal effects, a heavily scratched letter to his wife was found. Only one word remains legible beneath the strike-through: South. His successor, Joseph Verrill, took office that winter. Young, reform-minded, and eager, Verrill initiated several changes, unlocking sun shutters, revising chapel schedules, modernizing diet logs. But when his improvements reached the southern corridor, momentum stopped. In a personal notebook later donated by his estate, a list of confined patients appears. Each line bears brief observations. prone to fits. Requires bath assistance. All except the final entry. It contains no name, just a dash. Beside it, a note reads, "No access. Entry not advised." Then underlined twice. Varel never recorded speaking with the patient, never filed a re-evaluation. But in the margin of a quarterly review draft in his own hand, one can read, "Continue. Present confinement." The sentence cuts off mid-thought. He resigned in 1866. His resignation letter ends abruptly. Some cells are not overseen. They oversee. Dr. Augustus Matt inherited the post during the height of the institution's bureaucratic rigidity. A man of systems and process. Matt standardized logs, purged outmoded files, and introduced ledger tallies for daily staff duties. New construction plans were drawn, though none realized. Unlike his predecessors, Matt did not write cell 17's number. He merely initialed the space over and over on the back of Form 27B, the non-transitional quarantine log. Between 1867 and 1881, the bottom row of 27B was filled not with diagnoses but with two faint looping letters, "I am." No further comment, just the initials. Yet, in a private diary uncovered decades later from an attic chest in Marietta, a faint penciled note between budget scribbles offers a rare glimpse into Matt's private thoughts. It reads, "He's still in there or something is. No period, no structure." The note hangs in limbo, just like the cell it referenced. A loose, disquieted thought wedged between mundane accounting. When Matt retired in 1882, the position remained vacant for 7 months. During that gap, the fourth bolt of cell 17 remained untouched. Meal logs carried on. The lamp still burned. Form 27B, once marked by Matt's initials, was stamped instead. The mark was slightly off-center, rotated as if applied hastily. It read, "Confinement approved." There was no name beneath it, no new initials, no record across 3 superintendents, 6 directors, and 37 years of that door ever opening. In the autumn of 1872, the leaves along the Ohio River changed slower than expected. The trees clung to a dull, suspended green season, held in pause like everything else in the asylum's southern wing. It was during this unnatural stillness that Dr. Raymond Tenier arrived, a recent transfer from the Norwalk Sanitary Commission. By staff accounts, his demeanor was level, his manner clinical. He reviewed the archives, noted the lack of reassessment for several wards, and requested a full visual inspection of all quarantine cells. His tone was not urgent. It was procedural. He had read the records, and he saw too clearly the silence surrounding cell 17. The isolation ward had 5 cells. 4 of them had been checked without incident. But the 5th cell, number 17, was locked when Dr. Tilner reached the door. The nurse on duty that night was Judith Hallow, a midwife who had been with the hospital for 11 years, known for her calm demeanor and the way she spoke. She held her keys in both hands, her thumbs pressed together as if she were restraining something. When asked to unlock it, she hesitated. The 4th latch, hidden behind a floorboard near the base of the wall, was rusted on the inside, she said, and the door would not open. Dr. Tilner was skeptical, so he went to check the window above. It was a tall, narrow slit of glass, barred vertically and covered with a thin wooden panel. He tilted the panel, slightly peering inside. What he saw was not recorded, but Ms. Hallow saw something else. In the slanting beam of light that fell across the wooden floor of room 17, she saw the corner of an ink blotting sheet, square lined with linen, the edges softened by age. Beside it was a glass inkwell, half full. The rim was undusted. The ink had not yet set. The light glinted off the still rippled surface. There was no writing desk, no pen. Just those two things placed at the foot of the iron bed, arranged with the utmost care. The white paper, the open inkwell. When Dr. Tilner asked if anything was wrong, Miss Hallow said only, "The room looks as if it has been recently prepared." She did not elaborate. The remark was never recorded in the minutes. The doctor simply stepped back, making a note that he would submit a thorough investigation to the director, but the report was never sent. And Tilner never returned to the South Corridor. A week later, while taking inventory of the bedding, Miss Hallow quietly asked if anyone from the other wards had requested blotting paper. None. The ink bottles had not been brought into the quarantine area in over 12 years, both for safety reasons and because they were unnecessary. The main office's supply store was intact. Nothing missing, no new orders. Yet those two items were still there. In the following days, no one returned to the room. No one tried to open the door. But something had changed. The toilet book, which had been left blank for room 17, began to show faint pencil marks. The little lines appeared, disappeared, and changed their angle every week. In a letter dated October 9th, addressed to her sister, written quietly and in defiance of orders, Judith Hallow left a curious passage near the end. "I think someone in there keeps time. Someone counts the hours, but it's not my time. Not the real person, just an imitation or a thought that lives on in there." The letter was never sent. It was carefully folded, hidden in a wooden drawer, and only found by her niece many years later, after Miss Hallow's death in 1884. The fate of the blotting paper and the inkwell remains a mystery. In the 1874 revised inventory of the entire quarantine facility, there is no mention of stationery. The entry for room 17 simply reads, 1 iron bed, 1 wooden shelf, 1 working wall lamp. Yet, in 1880, an Episcopal minister called to the monastery to perform the winter blessing was ushered through the South Corridor during a power outage. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "There is a room near the back which I was told was empty. I only passed by, but by the light of the oil lamp, I caught a glimpse of something on the floor. The rim of a vase, I suppose. It may have been my imagination, but the glint made me think it had been dipped in something." The minister never returned to the monastery. His parish was annexed the following year and he was transferred north. And in the last surviving photograph of the door to room 17, taken in 1891, before the demolition, though yellowed and blurred, a thin shadow can still be seen in the lower right corner of the barred window. Indistinct, shapeless, but if you increase the contrast, you can see the iron foot of the bed and next to it, a square indentation in the dust-free wooden floor. Complaints began to come in from the builders. In the spring of 1876, the Ohio River Asylum undertook minor repairs to the south hallway. A small crack appeared in the wall that shared the boiler room, a common occurrence in older buildings when winter freezes cause the structure to shift slightly. A construction crew from Jefferson Township was hired to replace a joist patch the mortar joints and reinforce the wooden beams that had become fatigued from decades of stress. They came with hammers, levers, and carts of whitewash. Within 2 days, one by one men began refusing to work near cell 17. At first, this was dismissed as superstition. The asylum was full of rumors. Every corridor had its own fears. But the foreman, a practical man who did not give in to fantasy, eventually filed a stop work order. He cited unusual noise at the southernmost door. The wording of the report was cautious restrained, but in a private letter to his cousin, later discovered only because it had been tucked inside a forgotten work order. He was more explicit. It's not a noise. Not quite. The door seems to ring. Not loudly, just constantly, as if it were waiting for someone to touch it. As if it knew. No one could identify the source of the noise. Nothing could be heard from any other room, even across the corridor. Only when standing in front of the door of cell 17, with my ear to the iron bolts, did I feel it. A slight vibration inside, not coming from outside the object, but from within the very body of the door. One mason described it as a tuning fork pressed against wood. Another said it sounded like a glass blade scraping against water. No one could agree on the pitch. It was there, and it never stopped. The prison inspector, Vellum Sharp, was called in to investigate. His report is still on file. Continuous vibration observed at lower hinge of door 17. No frequency measured. No source identified. No airflow detected. Locking mechanism intact. Sharp concluded it was probably material fatigue, recommended reinforcement. But no damage was found. No warping. No loose hinges. No deformation. Perfect silence, but not silence. A silence that oppressed rather than withdrew. Finally, the decision was made: stop work on the south wing. The lintel replacement was abandoned. The scaffolding sat in place for 3 weeks, then was quietly removed. During that time, the staff avoided the south corridor. That sound, "It goes through the soles of your feet," said one staff member. A nurse said her oil lamp flickered in an indeterminate rhythm. No wind, no footsteps, just the beat. In an unsigned entry at the back of the maintenance book, hidden behind the oil bill and the chimney brush list, someone had drawn a diagram of the door. 4 bolts, a wooden panel, and in faint pencil, it breathes in. That week, a carpenter named Ellis, while repairing a broken wheel on a food cart, leaned against the outer wall of cell 17. He stopped suddenly. His co-workers saw the look on his face and asked, "Hear something?" Ellis replied, "Didn't hear, just knew." Like standing next to a voice that had been stifled for too long. He didn't return after noon. No official reason was given. The asylum's layout had been updated that summer. The hallway leading to cell 17 was marked inaccessible for maintenance. The floorboards around it were reinforced with crossbeams, though no weights were reported. The doors were still closed. The locks were still welded shut. But on a hot night in late August, a temporary cleaner sweeping near the corner of the hallway stopped by the board. He leaned forward, put down his broom. His account of the next day was not recorded in the log, but whispered to the laundry girl the next morning. It wasn't a sound. It was a change. It wasn't an up. It wasn't an down. It was a passing sound. It went over me. It didn't circle around. It went through. He was certain his shoes had left the ground for a moment. The following week's inspection report made no mention of the tremor. But at the bottom of the page, in a faint stroke from a broken pen, someone had scribbled. No sound this time, but silence. Shows. Amid the pile of transfer files, admission forms and shift schedules rotting in the abandoned office of the Ohio River Asylum. There was one form that was unlike the rest. Code 74T, a standard form from the 1860s, was used to transfer patients between wards. The date at the top of the form was March 12, 1868. Destination section 3A, Special Quarantine. Departure blank. Formerly, the sheet of paper was no different from the hundreds of other forms in the register notes on the patient's condition. Escorts, procedural comments, all written in the same familiar somber ink. But at the last line, the form broke with convention. Below the signature of the receiving party line, a name appeared, but not written straight down as usual, but written backward from right to left, each letter as if drawn from the inside of the paper out. When viewed through a mirror or glass, the name appeared dim, illegible. Perhaps a surname, perhaps not. The capital letters looked wrongly structured, the spacing was unusual, but it was clearly a human hand. Strangely, the ink was still blue, unfaded after 100 years. Yet the handwriting did not match anything in the records. According to regulations, the signature on the patient's admission had to match the list of nurses or staff in charge. But here there was no confirmation. No one had signed, no one had admitted to making the transfer, because in the records, no patient had been transferred. Cell number 17 was still sealed as before. No beds had been changed, no meals had been interrupted. Everything was normal except for this piece of paper stamped complete. It was discovered in 1871 when the staff took inventory of the archives. Strangely enough, it was not in the transfer file but in a bundle of unsent letters from 1865. Its condition was even more chilling. No smudges, no stains, no dust. Though all the other papers were discolored, water-stained or rotten at the edges. The ink on the paper was crisp and dry, as if it had been written only a week ago. But what sent a chill down the spine of the inventory clerk, Miss L. Carrick, was not the writing, but the way it had been imprinted on the paper. When she held the paper up to the sidelight, she saw that the signature had left no indentations, no pressure from the pen. The ink lay on the surface, but had not seeped in. The sample was then sent to a calligrapher in Columbus. His response was brief. "Kurt, this is not normal handwriting. The letters are mirrored without the natural curve of a right-handed person. It looks more like it was traced than written, but the strokes are unbroken." They also tried analyzing the ink. It did not match any material used in hospitals in the 1860s. In gaslight, the ink was a pale purple, but in sunlight, it turned black. With no trace of base metal, Miss Carrick filed a quiet report to the current director. In it, she wrote a simple sentence that was later quoted in 3 internal investigations. If the patient was not transferred, then someone forged this note, but I cannot determine who. After the incident, people began to notice that Carrick was often distracted. She requested a transfer to the West Wing, always carrying a small hand mirror, but rarely opening it. Finally, she abruptly resigned, leaving no explanation. In 1874, when the archives were cleared and moved, the form reappeared, not in its original place, but under a stack of ration cards from 1872. This time it was still clean, still as new. But there was a new detail in the lower corner of the page which had been completely blank. There was a faint diagonal line, like a census cross. Not the kind of mark made by an employee, but the kind used to mark "seen verified," but what it was, verified, no one knew. The paper was not re-archived, not destroyed. It was placed in a sealed envelope signed by the director and kept in drawer number 4 of the isolation cabinet. On the surface of the envelope, in faded red chalk, someone had written a word, "severed." No one knew what that word meant. No one opened the drawer again. No other patient had signed any papers since. And then, it all started with a tray of food, left untouched for 3 days. The first morning, the janitor said nothing. The food was cold, but not spoiled. The water was still sealed in the tin cup. The bread was hard, but not moldy. He marked it for collection a dash. Not used, not rejected, just no one. The second day, the food tray remained where it was. The third day, the food remained untouched. He called the warden. By November 18th, whispers had crept up the south wing. Cell 17 was silent, but silence was not unusual in that corridor. What was different this time was not the silence, but the absence. There was no rustling behind the wall, no sound of a tray being dragged, no flickering light coming through the crack in the door above. Only the unclaimed tray returning to the cart with the weight of a question that no one had the authority to answer. According to procedure, the incident had to be reported. Dr. L. Grandan, the facility's acting medical examiner, was summoned that evening. Tall, calm, with thin hands, Elrond was known for his habit of taking notes in silence. He tended to sit with the deceased for a long time before coming to a conclusion, as if listening to the last remaining tension in the room. Elrond arrived with gloves and inkwell and an unfilled death certificate form C-178. But the door had not been opened. No examination had been performed. No confirmation of status had been made. The lock was still sealed. On the fourth day, the tray had remained untouched. For that reason, Elrond decided to declare the death. He began filling in the basic information room, number, patient identification number. But when he got to the admission date section, the clerk could not find the original admission form. The main register from the 1840s had been checked 3 times. The room 17 reco long flagged as inconsistent was completely absent. The file number which had been used to track rations bedding and daily checks also came up empty. No records, no admission date, no name. Elrond still filed the death certificate with the State Health Department on November 22nd. 3 days later, the file was returned, stamped in red, refused, record not found. In the bottom margin, a typewritten note was attached, patient ID not recognized. Please verify admission documents. State records are incomplete. Elrond wrote a handwritten explanation outlining the 37-year confinement, with evidence of rations door checks and constant logs. He attached a copy of 3 pages of the ration book, proving that the patient was still consuming food until 1879. The department returned the file again. This time there were no notes, just a rejection slip with a single code, error 13. Below that, a pencil circle was drawn around the entry admission date. The problem, according to the state, was not the lack of a name or a medical evaluation. It was that there was no starting point, no hospitalization, no death. Elrond, beginning to feel confused, resubmitted the file with a late admission certificate using the first ration date of 1843 as the start date. But that was also rejected. The third copy was returned with a torn corner, as if it had been caught in the filing machine. In the signature box, the red stamp had crossed out illegal. Though the writing was legible, with no further instructions, Laurent tried one last time. In the confirming observations section, he wrote a strange line, assumed to be absent. No communication, no reaction, no signs of existence. The file was not answered, not returned, just disappeared. Laurent resigned the following year. In the lowest drawer of his desk, between a pair of folded gloves and 2 unused blotting papers, the death certificate remained crumpled but unstained. On the back of the form in faint pencil, he wrote a final sentence untitled, unannotated. If death requires a beginning, this patient cannot die. On the morning of the 5th day, the food tray was taken away. This time it was empty. The napkin was neatly folded and the oil lamp behind the screen still smoldered low, but steady. It had been 37 years since room 17 had been closed. Not locked, not barred, but closed. 4 bolts, a screen, and a food tray came and went without a word. The room was not visited, only noted. And for the asylum that was enough. But in April 1881, a new director took office. Dr. Edwin Ames, once of the Cincinnati Board of Inquiry, was a tall man with thin-rimmed glasses with a reputation for opening things up. He believed in new audits, new beginnings, and the elimination of bureaucratic inertia. He did not believe in superstition, and he did not accept that one door among hundreds should be sealed without any apparent reason. Within a week of taking office, Dr. Ames ordered room 17 unlocked. The request was handwritten, dated, and signed. No one spoke of it aloud. The request was filed under the vague title South Wing Maintenance Review, so no one objected. But the actual work was not simple. The 4th bolt, installed in 1842, had never been removed and was rusted into the stone. The wallboard that covered the lock had swelled and stuck so hard that even a chisel could not penetrate it. It took 6 men 3 hours to remove the internal mechanism. Screws snapped. Brass plates buckled under the pressure. The last hinge groaned like a deep, resisting breath. The last bolt, when removed, fell to the floor and broke into 3 pieces. Not bent, but broken. The door opened at 4:26 p.m., recorded in the log by a man who appeared only once in the archives. His name was not written in full, just C. Fenn, followed by a brief note room open. No response. What was found inside was never reported. There was no entry in the medical record, no entry in the physician's notes. The subsequent inspection sheet left the observation and recommendation fields blank. There was only a single line written in a different handwriting at the bottom of the form: no follow-up visit necessary. That evening, a memo was issued under Dr. Ames's title. The language of the document was brief, directive, and almost formal. In accordance with the spatial reassessment plan, the South Wing is to be restricted indefinitely. Access is to be granted only to authorized personnel. All records relating to Cell 17 are to be withdrawn from circulation. The phrase "withdrawn from circulation" had never appeared in any institutional document. It was not part of the technical vocabulary. Yet by the following Monday, all records relating to Cell 17 had disappeared. The ration book, the lamp rotation schedule, the door bolt check log, the patient statistics crosses, even the cleaning staff's sketches, all were removed from storage index cards, removed from drawers. Pages cut cleanly with blades so sharp that some could not be sewn back together. The corridor was closed for repairs. and the wall that had once held the door had been rebuilt with old bricks from the east fireplace, brick not the same color as the original stones. The mortar had cracked along the lines of the mortar after only a few days. There was no memorial, no sign, just a clean 6-foot section of wall as smooth as if the door had never existed. In a maintenance report from May of that year, the entry for South Wing Door Room 17 was replaced with a red mark, retired. Not retired, not changed, but retired. The word appears only twice more in the entire history of the institution. Once on an 1882 ventilation plan where the south corridor was noted as excess air retired. The other time it was written in faint pencil at the bottom of the janitorial department's materials requisition below the request for coal ash and vinegar. Retired, but not erased. Dr. Ames stayed on for 2 more years. He signed no further orders regarding that corridor. When a visiting physician asked in 1883 why the wall had no air holes, no lights, no signs, he simply replied, "That space has served its purpose. No further explanation. No return." And then 3 years later, during foundation maintenance, a contractor lifting a floorboard near the south wall found something stuck between 2 beams. A dinner tray, slightly dented at the corner. Inside was a napkin folded, once clean and still damp. As the Ohio River Psychiatric Institute prepared to close in the spring of 1888, the archivists were ordered to collect all the records and transfer them to the state archives in Columbus. It was supposed to take 2 weeks, but it took nearly a month. Most of the books were rotten. The bindings were cracked. The corners were curled. The ink had faded to iron brown or disappeared altogether. The pages, like the institute itself, had begun to disintegrate. But one book in the bottom drawer, beneath a slanted wooden shelf in the main archives, was remarkably intact. The binding was blue-gray linen. There was no title on the cover, only a label inside Final Operations Diary. South Wing. The writing inside was careful and neat. Each room, each day, each note was filled out in full. The pages were lined. No erasures, no crosses until the last page. The page was dated March 3rd, 1888, less than 60 days before the institute closed. But the ink on that page was much older than the others, faded unevenly, as if it had been written years earlier and then pressed between pages. The writing did not match the handwriting of those who had filled it in before. No heading, no name box, no time or inspector. Just one line sitting quietly in the middle of the page. I was never released. No explanation. No room number above. But the 3 pages before that were the entry for room 16. The next 4 pages blank. The emptiness around the words doesn't seem accidental. The pen might have been a brush, not a fountain pen. It had scratched lightly at the paper as if hesitating. But the writing was steady. No quivering, no embellishment. Just 5 simple words echoing in the final moments of a crumbling building. The staff assigned to prepare the south wing for demolition that spring made no mention of the notebook. No one admitted to writing it. The notebook was not listed in the archive's inventory. It didn't appear in the state's lost papers catalog until 1923. By then, the ink had faded to a grayish-gray, almost illegible. Later spectroscopy confirmed no abnormalities, no coloring, no chemical tampering. Just ordinary ink on paper that seemed to resist moisture. When the archivist tried to separate a sticky page with water, The droplet rolled off, leaving no trace. A 1930s historian penciled in the margin, "Not in any other book. Not repeated. No one else writes like it. No doctor or clerk of the period used such tight spacing or slanting. The ink was domestic, but the writing was not in the arched style of the time. Stranger still is the placement of the words. They are not flush with the left margin, but slightly off-center, as if the writer had stopped in the middle of a thought and finding nowhere else to say it had written from the depths of something. Some have suggested that the line was a joke, a later addition. But the way the ink overlaps the absorbency of the paper, the placement in the book, all are consistent with contemporary indexes. And when magnified, the ink strokes reveal a hesitation at the end of the word out, as if the pen had paused, not in tragedy, but in doubt. The line has been quoted in psychiatric textbooks, mystery novels, and mid-century folklore anthologies, often truncated, misquoted, or misplaced. But it always comes back. I was never released. Not I died here. Not I was forgotten. Not they left me. But something quieter, more deliberate, as if written by a hand that did not accuse, did not plead, but simply noted. And when the demolition crew finally came through the South Corridor, in the summer of 1891, they found no room behind the wall of where room 17 had stood. The wall was solid, no compartment, no bed, no air duct. But behind the bricks in the second floor of mortar, they found a tray intact. The napkin was folded once, and beneath the bread plate etched into the metal was a sentence written in soft ink, not engraved, not notched. Simply, I wait until the book is closed. Some doors are locked for a reason. Others are closed by repetition, until no one remembers who turned the key. In the case of room 17, the question was never why he stayed. It was why people continued to write about him long after they had forgotten he existed. And if a man can be fed, recorded, certified, without ever being seen what lies in the silent corners of history, waiting to be recognized. If this story moves, you follow seventh mark. Each of our stories is taken from real records, sealed, blacked out, or never allowed to be opened. And if you're still reading this far, let me know what country you're in and what time it is. Because it's a relief to know we're still out there, scattered across borders and years, reading the same last line on a page no one remembers ever having written.